Much of what you hear about organizations is the bad behavior. Whether it's Dilbert cartoons, The Office on TV, Office Space in the movies, or all over social media, terrible managers are everywhere. Let's see how the scope chart can help us understand why that happens. I'm Chris Williams, also known as CL Will. I have over 40 years of experience building and leading teams, including being a vice president in the Fortune 100. I'm a leadership advisor here to help you be a better and smarter leader. This is the third video in my series on scope, the perspective of your role in the organization. We're looking at scope through the scope chart that I introduced in the first video in this series. If you missed that first video, you might want to start there. For a quick refresher, this is the scope chart. We have the organization on the vertical axis, from the individual at the bottom all the way up through the team, division, company to the outside world. Along the bottom is time. Today, this week, this year, and so on to the life of the company. Your job's scope refers to its place on this chart. From the individual contributor down here, worried about today and their team, up through middle management, worried about larger parts of the org and over longer periods of time. Finally, at the top is the CEO, whose scope covers the company's place in the world and years into the future. There are several ways people misunderstand their role, or more accurately, the scope of their role in the organization. Along with that misunderstanding can come many bad behaviors. In this video, we'll look at some of the most common of these and how the scope chart helps explain them. One persistent complaint you often hear from people at the lower end of an organization is how their senior leaders are clueless, how little they understand about what happens day to day, how helpless that CEO would be if you dropped them into the line. That complaint is both true and a deep misunderstanding of organizations. What the complainers don't understand is that it's not in the CEO's scope to be focusing on the day-to-day, on what happens on the line. Just as the CEO would be out of place on the line, they would be lost in the boardroom or in a press conference. The scope of their job roles is entirely different. Jeff Bezos once talked about how silly it was that he was asked to participate in the quarterly earnings press calls for Amazon. His comment was, "I don't understand why I'm here. The last time I thought about the current quarter was 3 years ago. I'm busy working ahead 3 to 5 years into the future. This quarter was baked into my thinking a long time ago." In this way, Jeff is very typical of a large corporation CEO. You can see that on the scope chart quite clearly. The CEO is way up here. They're the face of the company to the outside world. At least half of their time is focused up and out, not down and in. And virtually all of their time focus is years, even decades into the future. They just can't possibly spend their time on the day-to-day. There are several layers of manager far more capable of discussing the current quarter than Jeff is. The people who should be talking about the current quarter are the division managers, the ones closest to the action, both in organization and time. But there are dozens of them, so the CEO has to be their stand-in for this press event. So, in a way, yes, the CEO is clueless about one individual team and about today and tomorrow. And the scope chart is a useful way of understanding why. It's not because they're an idiot, and it's not because they don't care. It's because it's not their job. Another way to see this is when a crisis comes up, when something goes terribly wrong, when there's an accident at the plant, when there's a very real day-to-day issue that causes a PR crisis. Many CEOs are completely at sea. They don't know how to respond, and many of them respond poorly. This is again not because they're stupid, it's because it's so outside their job. Ask them about the future of the company, ask them about projections for the stock price, and they're fantastic. That's their job. Explaining why there was a fire at the plant is quite literally someone else's job. This doesn't excuse them for not immediately coming up to speed. It doesn't excuse them for speaking without consulting with people who can help them understand. It just explains why they struggle. It's literally not in their job to know, and the scope chart shows that. One of the most common misbehaviors of managers is also easily understood from the perspective offered by the scope chart. That is, the micromanager. At any level above an individual contributor, the view from a role is two-sided. At the bottom of the scope chart, the main view is up. You look up to your manager. You look to tomorrow and next week. However, at every role above that, the view is more complicated. You need to look both up to your manager and further in time, but also down to your team and to a narrower view of today. This is one of the reasons why I said in the previous video that every role above individual contributor is very similar. You need to be looking up and down at the same time, and balancing that perspective is hard. Some managers get this balance wrong. A classic example is the micromanager. If you look at their scope chart, you can see what it looks like. They're smothering their team. Their focus is almost entirely down and in to their team and today. Often, this is an effort to ensure great results, but instead it hampers the team. It also comes at the expense of their view in the other direction. Not only are they likely ignoring their own manager, but they're lacking strategic perspective. We'll talk more about how scope and strategy are related in the next video. But what's clear is the micromanager's focus down and in comes at the expense of their relationship to the larger organization and planning for the future. The scope chart helps clearly shine a light on the micromanager, and it also shows the somewhat rarer inverse creature, the climber. The manager who virtually ignores their team because of their relentless focus on climbing the corporate ladder. They're entirely focused up on the scope chart at the expense of their team. To be clear, some teams really enjoy being left alone, but in most cases, the climber's relentless focus up the scope chart is nearly as detrimental as their more common cousin, the micromanager. In both of these cases, the people who focus too much on up or down, the solution is hard. Usually it requires their manager to point out the focus problem. They need to push them to readjust the balance, to highlight where they're spending too much time on one direction or another. But it's hard and takes time. Another way the scope chart helps to highlight misaligned priorities is with the one-dimensional player. These are people who focus entirely on one side of the scope chart or the other. Examples of this are people who have an organizational focus but lack the corresponding time attention. An example might be people in HR who are quite adept at working with people across the organization and at many different levels, but who also tend to focus on current problems at the expense of long-term issues. They work the organization with skill, but their long-term strategic thinking suffers. A complementary example might be someone in finance. They might have a division-wide charter and have a clear perspective on the time dimension. They're great planners for years into the future, but they have a narrow focus on their own organizational area. These are extreme examples, but the scope chart makes the lesson clear. As you look to your own role, you need to be careful to balance the two dimensions of the scope chart. You need to be sure that you don't over-concentrate on your effort to understand the organization, or to look to the future without any consideration of impact across the organization. You literally want to be well-rounded on the scope chart. The important lesson is that each move up the corporate ladder, each advancement on the scope chart, is a move in two dimensions. You need to increase your perspective across the organization and over longer periods of time. We'll discuss exactly how you do that in a later video in this series. As you're looking to work your way up the scope chart to a larger position in the organization, a common mistake is to bite off more than you can chew, to overreach in either dimension. I discussed earlier how the line worker is unlikely to fare well in the boardroom. In the same vein, at each position in the scope chart, it's important to recognize the limits of your view. An experienced frontline supervisor has a solid perspective of what it's like to work in their division. They understand the interactions of the various teams. They likely will even have opinions and suggestions on how those could be improved. Their perspective is clear, their observations keen, and their judgment in these matters is respected. They're also well-versed on the time dimension within reason. They understand the impacts of issues on this week and this month, maybe this year. And they can see how their team fits into these time periods, and their opinion in these matters is respected as well. However, a frontline supervisor lacks the perspective to make judgments about the entire company. They almost certainly don't know the pressures impacting other divisions or other territories halfway around the world. They also aren't privy to the plans and perils of the company in the decades ahead. So even though you might think you have thoughts on far-reaching areas outside of your scope, it's best to keep them closely held. Your lack of experience and perspective at those scales means your commentary on things far out in either dimension is likely to be dismissed. Ignored at best, taken as hubris or folly at worst. Discussing matters well outside your scope can even discolor your opinions on matters closer to hand. Offering advice way outside your scope can actually hinder your growth. Outside of private conversations, expressing those opinions will likely backfire. The scope chart illustrates clearly how this overreach can happen, and we'll discuss it more in the video on managing your career later in this series. But be careful to not play out of your league and overreach on the scope chart. The next video looks at how the scope chart illustrates what it means to be strategic. We'll define strategic thinking through the many questions organizations face. Not just the who and when that are obvious from the chart, but the how, the what, and the why things get done. And look at how the answers to those questions define an organization's strategy. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and click the bell so you won't miss each new video in this series. I'll see you in the next one, Strategic Thinking Through Scope.